Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining in again. I will probably be a little bit distracted allowing new entrances and latecomers to come in here for a few minutes, but if you see me glancing around and losing my train of thought for a moment, that's probably what I'm doing. But the long and short of today is that I wanted to review what we've covered last time, which dealt with the library module and coloring and tagging and renaming, and then using collections to support your organization strategy. And then the other thing I wanted to, and then we'll also dive, of course, more in depth into editing. We'll first go through what we covered. I'll take a brief minute or two to answer any questions that you guys might have that have come up. And then we will take it from there. Let me open up my notes so I'm looking in the right place. And I realized there were a couple things I didn't talk about last time that I did want to mention. So let's dive into Lightroom. All right. Everybody seeing that screen clearly? All right. Get stuff out of the way here. Okay. All right. So I pulled out a few photos here that we'll be using over the course of the class. But let me drop back into my, so just we'll review here quickly and kind of the structure of Lightroom. So over here in the catalog section, see where my pointer is? Actually, I'm going to see if I can highlight that pointer a little bit. I learned how to do this recently. All right, maybe that'll help you see my pointer a little bit. Well, it went away. Okay, well, never mind. Maybe we won't do that. Let's try that one more time. Spotlight. There we go. All right, so now you can see that little red dot. Maybe that'll help the visibility a little bit. So here we have the, sorry, I'm reorganizing my screen as we speak here. All this little things get in the way. Drop down here. All right. So here in the catalog section, we have the the section where all your photographs appear. You can see this is basically all of my images from the last 18 or 19 years that I've been shooting digitally. There's 80,000 some images in my Lightroom catalog. I only use one catalog. It's really the easiest way. Thanks to the next section we're going to talk about, collections. You really don't have to have a bunch of different Lightroom catalogs. Rather, you can take images you like. So I'm scrolling through images from Africa, and I can grab these images and drop them into any of these catalogs that are collections that I've created to sort them out into usable things. So these are all projects that I've worked on. So I did an article for a photography magazine about birds in flight, and so these are a bunch of images of mine of birds in flight that I pulled out for that. I've pulled out a section for this class called Lightroom demos, and those are images that we will probably get to today or in the next one. And so that's the really useful part about collections. There are things like smart collections, which I think is, honestly, I don't even know how to use it. Stu asked that question, and I have never played with it. I just use independently named collections, and I think it's a pretty effective way to just sort your images quickly. All right, elsewhere here in the develop module, down here at the bottom, you can sort your images by capture time, by added order, by edit time, any number of ways that you might want to sort and take a look at your images. That's a kind of useful tool if you're trying to find something that maybe you didn't adequately keyword along the way. You can also look, let me get back up to my main collection here. Actually, I'll just go into another one here that I pulled out. All right, so I am starting a new gallery of images on one of my websites. These are images that I pulled out today, kind of some of my highlights. And if I'm trying to decide, say, between two images, so let me just think, I'll randomly grab this image and this image. So I'm pressing the command key to highlight two images at one time. And if I go down here at the XY icon, I can see these two side by side. So if I am, these two might not be the best comparison, but if they're two similar images, you can look at them side by side and see which will fit better. Even if they're images like this and I'm wanting to match, color or structure or size of a space I might have in a design layout, I can look at these two images and go, this one is going to work better than the next. So that's kind of a useful little comparison tool within the library module. The other thing that we talked about last time was renaming photos. And that is all done up here in the library menu, and you can hit rename, and that allows you to bulk rename files. It's a really useful tool. You can set them to whatever you want. I believe, as some of you probably remember, I talked about doing that. Let me just rename a couple while I've got this open. So, here is an image that I took last night that is currently, named, some file number, and then with some extra stuff that I did in an external program last night. But I want to rename that to something a little more practical. So you can do this one at a time, or you can do it in bulk. And so I'm going to go to rename photos, and the code that I have in here is what I use. And this, it depends on how you want to structure your stuff, but I do mine with a shorthand: Colorado, the general location, Denver, the species of bird, redhead, REDH, and then I use a date code. So mine's 2020, and this one was made on the 29th of April. So I do 20 at the end, at each end of the number to indicate the year, and then 2904 for the month. This start number, you can set it to whatever you want, and it'll do it sequentially. And then I hit OK, and that file has been renamed. That gives me some keywords built into the structure of the program. All right, so I'm gonna stop my screen share here for a second, take a look to see if there are any questions. All right, so about the library module, because that's about all we're going to talk about that today. Is there anything that you guys had questions about? Feel free to unmute yourselves if you have questions, or just type it into the list, into the chat. Anyone? Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
I'm just trying to look at the chat.
Oh, hang on. Sorry, I think I unmuted you. You'll have to unmute yourself. I think I muted you. Apologize for that.
I close.
Got it.
Yeah, I was just trying to look at the chats. I don't have a questions.
Oh, okay, no problem. All right.
David, it's a two comparisons, side-by-side comparison, not a multiple, like 4 comparisons.
I believe you can do multiples. You might have to hit that. When I go back to Lightroom, I'll show you the other option for that. But you can do multiples, and they will appear. So you can definitely do more than one at a time. All right. Any other questions about the library section of Lightroom before we move on?
David.
Hey, Jennifer.
Hey, I was wondering, did you already? And maybe this is I spaced it, but how do you put a photo in the collection? So I see where you can put the plus, but then how do you get a photo to be in there, especially if you do batches? Super simple, click and drag. So just highlight the images you want, with a shift click, or do independent images with an alt option click, and just grab the images you want and then click and drag them into the icon. I'll show you how to do that here in just a sec when we go back to Lightroom. Anybody else? All right, great. Let's dive back into Lightroom then. All right, so Jennifer's question about how to include an image in a collection.
Let me just do that right here. I'll go back to all of my photos. And let's just say I want to take this photo of a redhead that I photographed last night, and I want to add it into the collection that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to scroll down through my way too long list of collections. This is the one we want, where it says Lightroom. It's actually called Lightroom Demo, but it's cut off. So I'm just gonna, let's just say I'm gonna grab a couple of these. So I want this one, and this one. And I am just going to grab the photo itself and drag it over and put it into the correct file. And sure enough, there they all are. Keep in mind that it doesn't actually move the photo. It just moves a pointer to it. So it's a little bit like putting a reference to a file on your desktop of your computer. It doesn't actually move the location of the photo. I can take those same photos that I've just added, those 3 that are still highlighted there, and I can delete them right out of Lightroom, right out of the catalog. But if I go back into my main, or sorry, out of my collection, but if I go back into my main all photographs part of my catalog, they're still there. So they didn't actually get deleted, they just got removed from the collection. So anything you do in here, you can delete, you can add, you can subtract, you can do whatever you want, and it will not impact you won't be able to delete the images from the main catalog. All right. So let's dive into a little bit of editing. So I'm going to start off with kind of a high contrast one. So I've just selected the image I want to edit. And I'm going to hit develop. All right, so this is from the Valley of 10,000 Smokes in Katmai National Park last summer. I believe, Andrew, you were standing right next to me when I took this photo. And it's a super high contrast scene. So you can look here at the histogram in the top corner. Let me get my little red pointer thing going again. And you can see here in the histogram that despite having this bright white area in the lower right corner of the frame, it actually doesn't quite cut off. If there was something pure white, it would show up and that triangle would be turned color. There is a little bit lost in the pure black. So look as I hover over this triangle. So watch as I move my pointer up to that blue triangle, and then look down in the lower left part of the screen, just up from the bottom, you'll see a tiny little spot has turned blue. I'm gonna move back and forth so you can see that. See that spot turn blue? So that is the area that's pure black. That's an area that's lost its data. If there was an area of pure white, we would be able to do that same thing by hovering here. Because it's such a tiny spot, I'm not really worried about it in terms of this image. So despite this being super high contrast, just about everything that I want out of the image is there. So all the detail, though you can't see it, is actually in this image. So in this part of the frame right here, though it looks really blown out, there is actually still data and information there, and I should be able to retrieve it.
Excuse me, Dave.
Yes, go for it.
Excuse me. Do you control the people, the vision of the people on the screen? Because on my computer, those pictures are covering up the histogram. Could you move them over to our left side of the screen if other people are having that problem as well?
So that's up to you, Leslie. If you go up and you can drag that part of your screen around all you want. And if you look at the top of that little, where you see the pictures of the people, there will be a couple of different icons, and you can click through those and find out the one that hides the most. The one that's just a single thin line on the left side will collapse that part of your screen.
Okay. Okay, they're collapsed. Now I can see the histogram. Thank you very much.
No problem. Okay, so back into this image, I am going to, so the first thing that I'm seeing with a problem, whenever I come in a new image, I want to kind of assess, okay, where are the problems? Where are the things that I want to improve? Where are the things that I need to, bring detail back, cropping, all that sort of stuff. I try to look at that before I really start rolling with the image. So what I want to do in this photo is, I know this is a problem. This area here in the lower right, I need detail in there. This is a waterfall without the detail. it's just a cloud, and it doesn't look interesting. You know, elsewhere in the image, I don't mind this darkness over here. I think that's okay. If this is kind of blown out, this kind of really interesting volcanic silt cliff has lost a lot of its detail and texture here, but I know it's still there because I haven't blown out my highlights. And then I might want to try to bring in a little drama into those clouds, or I might just decide I want to get rid of those clouds entirely by just cropping them out. So the first thing I am going to do is just bring down the highlights a little bit. And you can see a little bit of data started to come back into there. But most of the problem in this image, it looks like it's going to be falling into the whites. So I'm going to bring down the whites. And you can see data, you know, info you start to see a bit of texture coming back into here. The whole image maybe is just a little too bright to be able to deal with that. And so I'm going to temporarily reset these by double clicking anywhere on the slider. We'll reset it to the center point. And I'm going to go up and I'm going to change the exposure. And I'm just going to bring the whole exposure of the image down a bit. And you can see a lot of that texture and detail starting to come back in. And then I'll start readjusting the highlights again. I'm not going to touch shadows yet. Right now, I'm mostly concerned about those bright areas. So that's more or less how I would probably want this part of the image to look and this part of the image to look. So I did that by adjusting the exposure and adjusting the highlights and the whites. Now, in the process of doing that, I've made the image look a little dark. You can see I've actually lost more detail here. There's a little bit more in that blue area that's been lost. So if I hover over that, you can see over on the left side of the frame, some areas have gone to blue. That's an area where detail has been lost. Fortunately, it's still not a very big area. I'm still not too concerned about it. But the rest of it is, you know, can use to be a bit of brightening. So I'm going to try an initial check, maybe just by bringing up some shadows. I can retrieve some of the data from some of those trouble spots. Blacks, I don't like to mess with. I find too much anyway. If you bring the blacks up too much, it starts to look too flat. If you bring them down too far, of course, then you end up with large areas of lost data. So blacks is a one to be delicate with. Whites is too. If you lose too many whites, like if I take that all the way down, you just see how the image kind of went gray. So if you have some whites, you can use them to give your image a little bit more crisp and pop. But if you take them down too far, it can really make your image look a little flat and gray. So you have to be careful with how you deal with both your whites and your blacks, because they kind of have a disproportionate impact. So I'm just sliding it back and forth a little bit until I find a point with the whites that I like a little better. So that's not a bad first pass. I'm going to go down here. If you guys remember, you can see what you've done to the image by clicking here where it says YY. And there it goes. You can see the original very bright and the one on the right that we've done just by adjusting a few of those sliders. We've managed to make that quite a different looking image. The next section in our develop basic module here is texture, which kind of adds a little bit of sharpness. It's not really sharpening. It's more, it takes, you know, like areas where there's fine texture, like the scree slope over here, or the, you know, sort of the details in the rocky areas, or the leaves, areas where you have fine texture, and it will increase the contrast area in those sorts of sections. And you can see as I slide that, if I take it all the way up to the right, it can add it makes things look pretty sharp, but it also makes it look maybe a little fake. So, you know, use it with a grain of salt, just like all these sliders. Clarity increases the contrast at edge points. So where darks meet lights, it increases the contrast between those points. So you can see a pretty big difference. If I take it all the way down here, everything starts to look hazy and weird. And if I take it up, you know, too far, then, you know, it starts to look a little strange too. But a little bit of clarity almost always helps an image look a bit sharper than it would have otherwise. Dehaze, I joked last time that I had a client who called it the hammer, and it is a powerful tool. If you add too much of it, it looks really odd. But, you know, in a moderate especially, and in fact, the name is quite apt. If you have a little bit of fog or pollution or haze in the air, or wildfire smoke, the dehaze can actually cut through that pretty nicely. And if you wanted to do something a little more dramatic, like add fog, you can actually do that with the haze as well by, sliding it down, and you can see how it starts to look like I'm shooting through a fog or mist. And I'll talk more about that here in a second. Vibrance increases the saturation of the middle saturation tones. So if you have areas that are not particularly colorful but have some color, if you bring that saturation up, or that vibrance up, you'll start to see color pop in. Look at the red cliff in the background, and you can see additional stuff, additional color starting to pop in. Take it too far, and it begins to look a little fakey. However, most images can handle a fair amount of vibration or vibrance, especially raw images, before you reach that point. If you're shooting in JPEGs, which I wouldn't recommend anyway, if you're going to be using Lightroom, you want to be shooting in RAW. But if you are working with JPEGs, then you won't be able to add very much vibrance or saturation before things start to look fake and weird. Saturation is a global change. It increases the colors, the luminance and the saturation of colors across the spectrum. So across your whole image. So it does not take far to make that start to look a little strange. Fortunately, this is a fairly low saturation image to begin with, and you can actually get away with a fair amount of saturation without wrecking this particular image. Some images will start to look weird very soon. So that's sort of a first pass along this basic module. Now, as I promised, one of the things I wanted to talk about today is the brush tools and the tools up here. And so this square is cropping. We mentioned that a little bit last time. This one is the clone tool. I'll talk about more about that here in a minute when we work on a different image, but we will get back to this one. This is red eye. If you do a lot of portrait stuff and you've got red eye to deal with, you might play with that. Honestly, I've never used it. This one, the rectangle, is the graduated filter tool. It doesn't have to be neutral density. You can use it any number of ways, but I'm going to put one across here. So let's just say I wanted to darken this whole area right here. So I like how dark this part of the foreground is, but let's just say I want to darken this area in the background. I can select the filter here, click and drag, and this you can see how I'm changing the width. There's 3 lines. That is the edge. So how long, the feathering of the edge of the filter. So I'm just going to drop it right there and pull down the exposure. Now that doesn't really work too much, but maybe a little bit of, bringing the whites down a little bit, or the highlights, or, maybe I just decide that I don't like that at all. As long as this is a black, see the black circle in there? You can see the area that's affected by that when I hover over it. But as long as that one, if that black dot is highlighted, all I have to do is hit the delete key and it poofs away. So, I don't think I need that particular filter here. This one is called the Radial Filter. It does the same thing, except it does it in circles. Honestly, I very rarely use it. Sometimes I might use it to grab, say there's an animal in a landscape that's distant. So I have a bear walking across a distant landscape or something like that. I may grab that, put a circle around the subject I want to do, and either brighten or darken it to try and draw some attention to it. It's very rare that I use this tool. If I see an opportunity in any of our talks to show you how that works, I'll do that. But my favorite tool is this one. It's the brush. This allows you, according to Lightroom, it's called the adjustment brush. I use this a lot. Almost every image I use this particular tool. So you can see here where my mouse is. You have a lot of controls in this. So for this photo, let me say let me see if I can darken in this, bring in a little bit more of the detail into this bright corner here. So you can adjust the size of the brush either by using the slider or by scrolling on your mouse or your trackpad to increase the size. The feather is the edge of you can see the filter. If I adjust the feather, so there you can see I have a very small feather, I tend to like to have a pretty broad feather. I actually have it on 100 most of the time. Flow is basically the amount of brush you put on any given stroke. So if I have it set to 50, then it takes me 2 passes over the same part of the frame in order to apply the full power of the brush that I've put on. So you can, if you have it set down really low, like at 10%, then it'll take you 10 times to pass over the same part of the frame. So it allows you to quite literally brush it in. I find for general use, a single pass allows me to do most general work. So I often have it at 100, but sometimes I'll have some fine detail work where I want to lower that down. So flow is the number of times it takes you to go over a certain part of the frame and have its full effect. This little bugger, auto mask, is deceptively helpful. Auto mask will take an edge and it will decide that's where you want to stop your brush being applied. So if I were to click the auto mask and then brush in everything to the right of this, but I hit a little bit on the edge of this cliff face, Lightroom will decide not to apply the brush onto those rocks. The reason I call it deceptively helpful is because it's not really very good at it. So often it will cross over and partially apply a brush. Some places, sometimes it will leave a little halo of an edge around the light, around the edge point, making it look a little weird if you apply a certain amount of brush power to it. So, be wary of auto mask. It's useful in the right conditions. I'll show you how it works here in just a second. And then the last one is density. Density, so think of that, I had it described to me as a credit card with a limit. So if you don't want ever the full power of the brush to go over a certain part of your image, if you put that to 50, only 50% of the brush will ever be applied to any part of the frame, no matter how many times you go over it. I generally apply it at 100. I can always pull it back later if I want. Okay, so let's do a little brushing. So I am going to go ahead and turn my exposure down before I start brushing. And I'm going to turn it down a lot, mostly because it allows me to see where I have applied the brush without having to do any other extra steps. I am going to put on auto mask just to show you how that works here on the edge. Actually, I'll do it twice. I'll do it once without auto mask and once with. So I've got the exposure turned down, and now I'm going to click and I'm going to brush in. So this looks really black. That's fine. This is just showing me where I'm brushing. So I want to make sure I've gotten a fair amount of this troublesome corner, not left too much. So there we go. And now I can adjust. So now I've got everything I know where I want. I'm going to go back up to exposure. I'm going to bring that back up. Now you can see that this area remained quite a bit darker. So maybe I don't really want the brush in that area. So all I have to do is hit Alt. So look at the plus sign in the middle of that brush. When I hit the Alt key or the Option key, it turns into a minus sign, and I can erase that section if I want to. So you can see how you can sort of start to create these, these areas where you can be pretty precise. Okay, so now let's get rid of that. So I've got that highlighted. I'm going to hit the Delete key. It kicks it out. And I'm going to put on the auto mask. And we're going to do that. I'm going to make a little bit bigger brush this time. And I'm going to, got my exposure turned down. And I am going to brush right around the edge. See, and already see if you spend too much time lingering over the wrong side, it will screw it up. I'm going to get rid of that, try it one more time. So I want you to see how this works along that edge. See how that works? How, as long as I didn't get the main part of my brush around the edge of that rock face over here, it didn't cover it. So if I hover over that, it'll turn red, and you can see I didn't impact at all the rock portion of the image, thanks to auto mask. And here it looks like it actually did a pretty good job. So let me touch up a little bit up here. And now I'm going to readjust the exposure. Maybe bring some highlights down. Maybe add a little texture, see if we can bring some of that detail in. See that detail start to pop back in there. A little bit of clarity to do the same. Maybe even dehaze, you know, you just never know. So this allows you to selectively apply brushes to certain parts of your frame. And so this tool is great. It's more than just dodging and burning like you would have back in the darkroom days. It allows you to do more than simply lighten and darken parts of your frame. It allows you to adjust color. It allows you to do, you know, adjust sharpness and the texture and the haze and all of these settings over here. It gives you that control over. So nifty little tool. I'm going to get rid of that for this image. And we are going to move on to a different image. So let's back out of this. Okay, so I mentioned that that gives you local control over color. So here is a photo of the Canning River on the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's pretty high contrast, taken on kind of a semi-overcast day, bright, but definitely a little grayish. The river, as I remember it, it was very blue, kind of this, you know, not quite glacial, you know, Banff blue, but a nice clear blue color. That didn't really come out here, thanks to the, you know, you can see a little bit of the kind of bluish aqua color in the shaded portions, but, you know, we lost a lot of that. You know, the foreground here has a bit of darkness. I can see my horizon line is a touch angled, so there's something to fix. And the clouds have some really bright highlights. You can see up here in my histogram, I've lost, see where that turns red? That's where I've lost some of the highlights. Not very much, I can work with that. And then I've also lost a few blacks. So look right at the base of the fireweed there in the foreground. Actually, that might be delphinium in the foreground, and you can see that turns black. So I've lost a few of the highlights, but not bad. Small specks in each places. I can deal with that. So I'm just going to do a very quick, you know, assessment of our image in the standard basic sliders. So these are just the things I quickly adjust. I'm going to do a very quick first pass in the interest of time. Increase the shadows a little bit to bring some of the detail back in. I think I'll bring the whites down just a touch because there's some bright highlights in the sky. Maybe bring the black up just a hair to try and retrieve some of that data. If I go back and hover, I can still see there's a few black spots, but if I go much farther, it's going to start to look gray. A little bit of texture increase, might add some sharpness overall. Generally, you can see how that makes the clouds pop a bit. Dehaze I'm not going to touch. A little bit of vibrance, a little bit of saturation, and that's a first pass. Okay, I mentioned that my horizon was a touch off, so I'm going to click on the crop tool, and I'm going to grab the angle tool. So you see that angle right there? I'm going to click on that, and then I'm just going to go to my horizon, and I'm just going to drag a line across the horizon line. And Lightroom will assume that is the point that I want flat. It wasn't very far off, but a little bit. I'm going to double click to accept that crop, and now I have a flat horizon. And crop is done. So then, what are the other things that are issues here? You know, the sky, I'd like to see a little bit more texture in the sky. So why don't we grab our graduated filter? The graduated filter is really useful when you have something like a horizon line, something straight that you want to work with. If you're trying to dodge around a curved edge, it's not a particularly useful tool, but it's great if you want to separate the sky from a foreground landscape. So I'm more or less, I've got my brush set right, or my filter line set right along the horizon line. Obviously that's too dark, that looks weird. But, you know, half a stop of light reduced there. Pretty good. That looks kind of neat, actually. Added a lot of drama to the sky. Clarity, I find, is a very useful tool for bringing in some texture into clouds. I can slide that up And you can see that, you know, how those changes come in. It darkens the grays, it gets the whites a little bit more pop. I don't want to do too much. Texture probably won't do a whole lot. No, texture doesn't do much because it's not fine enough pattern, or not fine enough texture. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now, the other thing you can do here with any of these tools, but I'll demonstrate it with this. So when I darken that sky, it looks a little gray. And I wonder, maybe I can just selectively, just in the sky, using that same graduated filter, adjust the color temperature of the sky, make those clouds look just a touch bluer, a little more cyan. So see, as I slide my slider down, see, that's too much, but you can see where I'm going with it. So I'm just going to bring that back into an area where it looks a little more, you know, a little less black and white and a little bit more color. It's not going to take very much, a few points. So you can see that's a pretty big difference. If I go, let me turn off that filter. And if I go back down here to the YY, I suspect we'll see a pretty big difference in that image. You know, it looks really, well, it looks a lot better. So, but we can make it even better. So now, let's think about what else we want to do. So I've done some nice stuff with the sky. The sky, I think, looks really good. I really miss the fact that the river is not showing that really blue tone that I miss, that aqua tone of those North Brooks Range, clear flowing North Brooks Range rivers, coastal plain rivers. I want that to be blue. So what I can do is I can go in, grab my brush, select a size that's appropriate. I think I'm going to use a little fairly sharp on the edges of the river. And my exposure is set down so I can see where and I'm going to go in. I don't need to get all over, but I just do have the auto mask still clicked there. I'll see how that works. We may end up turning it off. I'm getting a warning that my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully that you guys can still hear me fine. And at any rate, that's the area where the most color is, the place that matters to me most. So I'm going to grab that. I'm going to reset our exposure back to normal. That just allowed me to see where I was painting. And now there's a couple of things you can do. So, you know, I could just increase the saturation. So I could just go, you know, take that up, you know, and I can selectively saturate just the river. And that actually did a pretty good job. It more or less accomplished what I wanted, brought back in some of those turquoise tones. But I'm going to show you another way to make that happen too. So down here at the bottom, you can see where it says color, and there's a square with an X on it, a rectangle with an X on it. And that rectangle with an X is color. So that means there's no color being applied. So you can see as I hover over that, it says no color effect. But if I click on that, it allows you to select a color. And so as I want this to look, I want it to look kind of turquoise. And so in this sort of turquoise blue region of my image, of this color palette, I can click and it will apply obviously in this case, a very inappropriate color over the whole image. You can do it at any level of intensity. So that I might be wanting a little more blue and a little less green. So I'm going to take it to the right. And basically I'm trying to find the correct color tone, but not the same color intensity. So that's not too far off. Now, once I've found more or less the right color, I can take this, see the little eyedropper tool I've got here? I can bring that down closer to the whites and click again, and it will apply still color, still that same color, but less of it. And you can click around until you find that spot that works best for how you have envisioned that particular brush. So I'm just sort of clicking a few times, seeing what I'm coming up with. And even that's a little bit too much. So we're just gonna go, but I like the color, so we'll go right there. Not too bad. We'll close that. And so now I have applied a color. Now the danger of doing that is, and let me confirm that I'm right, if I go up to apply another brush, oh no, it goes away. Okay, so if you select anything before you start brushing, it'll also apply it to the next brush. So if you wanted to, if you need to get rid of a setting that you didn't like from a previous brush, you just go back into your color palette and select the bottom, either bottom corner, and it will get rid of any color effect applied. So other things I might want to do with this image. So I think I overdid that a little bit, but you know, for demo purposes, it's okay. But you know, if I did decide I just wanted to get rid of that, I just go back up to my brush, I go over and I click on the brush that I just created, and I can hit the delete key and it'll go away. But the last thing I wanted to do on this photo was look a little bit at the foreground. So, you know, it's not a particularly interesting foreground. It's just a, you know, a clump of brush. But, you know, there is some texture there. So I'm going to grab that with my brush tool. I'm going to turn off the auto mask. I don't know if you can see, but it didn't grab every part of that bush because it saw edges in there. So I'm going to turn off the auto mask, rebrush in that bush, bring our exposure back up to what it regularly was. You know, maybe I'll brighten that a little bit. You know, just bring that up, you know, a third of a stop, bring in some of that green. You know, that's kind of nice. You can see it. Maybe I'll add a little clarity to it, maybe a touch of texture. And now we have a little bit more detail and interest in that, you know, otherwise kind of bland foreground. We're going to unclip that. And, you know, I'm going to mostly skip over these things. We did talk about sharpness and noise. I'll probably get to those here in the next image. But the last thing I want to apply to this is a vignette. I believe I quoted Ansel Adams in our last talk, just closing some of these that we're not going to talk about, that Ansel Adams said, every image warrants a vignette, but the viewer should never really be aware that there's a vignette. So darkening, I don't, you know, unless you're a 1970s era wedding photographer, you probably don't want a white vignette. That just looks tacky and extremely dated. And it distracts because our eyes are naturally drawn to light areas of the frame, and you don't want anybody looking to the outside of your frame. So rather a small dark vignette, usually somewhere between, you know, obviously you would take it down this far, that's way too much. But you know, sometimes somewhere in the teens is usually fairly appropriate, sometimes a little less. I find, you know, somewhere between 11 and 15 is usually pretty appropriate for most landscape photos. And there, you know, that's a pretty decent photo now. Thanks to increases in color, a lot more vibrance here in the water. It really looks a lot more how I remember this kind of dramatic afternoon along the Canning River. So pretty cool. All right, so let's take a moment for questions. I'm gonna stop my screen share here. And all right, so looking through the notes, anybody have questions? Okay, let's see. All right, so, okay, Michael Wald asked, do the edits to an image in a collection affect the image in all places? Yes, Michael, they do. So if you are working out of a collection like I am here, you will indeed make changes in all places. So edits do, but you can delete an image from a collection and it won't delete it out of your whole catalog. Are the images in the catalogs the raw files? Or are they pointing to a raw file? Okay, so Steve, those are images. So anything in your catalog is pointing to an image on a hard drive somewhere. So mine are all on an external hard drive. When you make a change in Lightroom, it doesn't actually change the file that's stored on your hard drive. Rather, it just records those changes so that within Lightroom, you can export it with the changes whenever you need to. So it's non-destructive, nothing changes in your original file. It just records those changes in your catalog. Brush tool in clouds, yep, Fletcher, you can use the brush tool just as easily as you can use the gradient tool. I just like the graduated filter tool because it's, you know, it works really well against a horizontal landscape or any vertical or, you know, any flat point of your image. It works very effectively to do that. Duplicate images, good question. When we get back into Lightroom, I'll show you how to create a virtual copy, and that's a very effective tool. Overlay of brush grad, yes. Andrew, you can do multiple layers if you want to. You can put, 20 layers of different brush effects onto an image at any time. I will often have a couple of different brushes that overlap, particularly if I want to, partially darken one part and then more darken another part. I can overlap those or lay them right on top of each other, no problemo. How do I set up my Olympus lens to be recognized in the Lightroom menu? Eleanor, so if you keep your Lightroom up to date, it should have all of the commonly used lenses in their catalog, so it knows their faults and knows how to adjust for them. So Olympus should have all of their lenses put in. I know I've never had a problem. It always recognizes my lens. The camera records what metadata, and that includes the lens type, and Lightroom can recognize that and adjust it. Otherwise, if it's not recognizing it for some reason, you can select it manually out of the menu. All right, any other questions before we move on? We have time for at least one or two more images to look at.
David,
Yeah,
I have a question. I was wondering, is there a situation where you would rather, for instance, if you use a polarizing filter on your lens, it's better to use that than to try and do it in post, like for instance, if you're taking photos of water?
So polarizers are probably the one place that Lightroom and Photoshop and post-processing cannot emulate yet. There's a couple of attempts that have been out there, but polarizers, just about all the other filters, UVs, neutral densities, all that, you can emulate that in Lightroom, but polarizers kind of have an effect on the light itself entering the camera. So if you're going to use a polarizer, you need to do that in the field.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Dave.
Right. Yeah.
Is there a good help function in Lightroom? So if I forget the difference between brightness and contrast or dehazing, and just to get a quick reminder of what each one of those sliders does for you, is there a reference that you can point to?
Sadly, I find the help function in Lightroom not, unless you're trying to find a menu or find an item in one of the modules, I don't find it's very good for kind of tutorials about telling you what different things do. However, there is a world of Google out there. So whenever I have a question about Lightroom, I find that if I just enter it in Google or go to the Adobe website, Adobe's got great tutorials built into their websites for each of the different pieces of software they make, and you can find answers there. They have good forums. There's a bunch of nonsense information there too, but basic questions like that you can probably get the answer to just with a simple Google search, or email me and I can tell you what it is to the best of my knowledge. All right, anybody else before we move on?
David?
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
When you were doing your grad and your brush, you used the exposure to show where you'd been. There's an overlay button that brings it up red, the same as if you touch the little dot. I use that all the time. Sometimes it's a little bit sort of hazy around the edges, but your use of the exposure seems to make it highlight a lot better.
Yeah, what is that shortcut key? Remind me of that, Andrew. I don't use it very often. So
it's down the very bottom. It's got when you're in that, it's got overlay. Right.
Yeah.
Right down.
Yeah, and that is a useful tool, but I'd find that this way I don't have to press any keys or have to unclick anything, and I can just adjust it later. So that's my technique. If people like to see other ways to doing it, then that's a healthy way to do it. I believe there's a shortcut key too that you can press down one of the keys, but I don't remember off the top of my head which one it is. So, all right. So if nobody has more questions, then we will dive back into Lightroom. All right, so we've gone through that image, and so let's do, which one should we work on here? We haven't done a wildlife shot, although I don't think that's going to have what I want to talk about in it. Let's do, I don't know, what do you guys want to do? Do you want to do a wildlife shot? Do you want to do Do you want to do more landscape? I'm going to save the HDR and panoramas for our next talk. But what do you think? What do you guys want to do?
Good.
Wildlife.
What was that? So put it in the so wildlife. I'm getting a few wildlives. Wildlife, cool. All right, wildlife it is. All right, so let me go. All right, let's do a bear shot. So this was kind of a overcast day at Brooks Falls this last summer, and this, here we have a, it's a fine shot, nothing particularly extraordinary about it. It's not one I've processed before, so obviously it's not one that really stood out to me compositionally, but it should give us a little bit of information on what we can do to make images of wildlife. And a lot of this will apply to people too, look the best we can. So again, whenever I'm starting a new image, I want to look at it and decide where I have problems and what's good. So I can look right away and say, this is a little bit too bright, where the clouds are reflecting around here in the reflections. I like that to be a little brighter because I'm finding my eyes descending from the bear, where I want people's attention, down into this pale area at the bottom of the frame. And the eyes of the bear are a little bit dark. I can probably brighten that up. He's got a little bit of a halo. Some of these areas around his back are a little bit too bright. So, bringing down some highlights, bringing up some shadows, maybe darkening in the areas around him will help a bit, or her actually in this case. It's pretty sharp, but we can add a little bit of sharpening to really try and enhance that as much as we can. Maybe we'll selectively add a little bit of texture, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. Okay, so we'll do, we've already talked about this a bunch of times, so I'm going to do a first pass quickly. I'm bringing down the highlights. Look here in the foreground, you can see those highlights in the water change pretty dramatically, pretty quickly, just by bringing down those highlights without impacting almost anything else in the rest of the chain in the frame. So I'm going to bring down those highlights, and that solved a lot of my problem in one fell swoop with what I had pointed out there. Shadows, I'm going to bring up the shadows a touch. If you bring them up too much, it can start to look a little kind of high dynamic range, HDR style. This image actually isn't too vulnerable to that, but some images start to look pretty weird if you bring the highlights all the way down and the shadows all the way up. But here I can get away with a fair amount without making the image look too fakey. Whites, there are not a lot of whites in this frame. So if you guys will remember, the whites are just this far right part of the histogram. And you can see I have very little data in there. And so there's not really a lot, I can adjust the white slider a pretty fair amount without having a big impact on the image, but I don't really want to, because if I slide it down too far, see how it starts to look gray? I lose all those nice highlights that gave my image some pop. So I'm not gonna touch that at all. Blacks, a little bit of darkening in some parts of the frame might actually help a little bit. It'll add a little bit of apparent contrast and make things look maybe a little sharper, but not very much. I don't want to lose any data, but a little bit of darkness might not be a bad idea. I am not going to apply texture or clarity or dehaze to this image using the overall function. Remember, anything I do in the basic module is going to impact the whole image. I'm going to want to add some texture to the bear. I may even want to subtract some texture from this, from the grassy area in the background, but I don't want to do anything to the full frame. So we're not going to deal with that yet. Vibrance, I can add a little bit of color to the whole image here. It's too yellow. See how the yellow, it starts to look a little too yellow. So, maybe a little bit of vibrance to make the greens pop a touch, but maybe a touch of saturation. But yeah, there's really not too much I need to do there. So let's talk about the bear himself. So his exposure, I think, is pretty good. I'm going to zoom in on him. I just recalled, remind me at the end of the last questions to show you guys about the virtual copy. That was something I forgot to do, and it just reoccurred to me. So we'll get back to that, but we'll do it last. All right, so I'm looking at the bear. He's got good T-tail. He's plenty sharp. There's no issues with sharpness here at all. But, you know, the eyes are the gateway to the soul, as they say, and bears have notoriously small and difficult to see eyes. So adding a little bit of info to the bear's eyes is probably not a bad idea. I am going to zoom in even further on the bear's, oops, wrong way. I'm going to zoom in quite far, just on the bear's eyes. This is way over 100%. This is actually at about 300% view, and so it starts to show a little bit of pixelation. I'm not really worried about that. And I'm going to go up here and I'm going to grab our brush tool. And I am going to select a very small brush, you know, more or less the size of the bear's eye. The center of the brush should be a little bit smaller than the bear's eye. And then I'm going to paint in his eye, paint in the other eye. And now we have a zombie bear because I've got the exposure down so far. So we will change that. And we'll brighten him up. Maybe not quite so much. It's pretty easy to make this look a little fakey or clearly done. So we'll go about 1/3 of a stop. I'm going to add a touch of clarity. That actually darkens the overall look. So I can actually go back up and add a little bit more because clarity tends to darken a bit. Oops, I went the wrong way. All right. And that's probably all I really need to do with the eyes. So let's go back to our full frame, and you can see that the eyes look quite a bit better as a result of our efforts there. Now I'm going to apply another brush just for the bear himself. I'm actually going to turn on the auto mask for this because I want the Lightroom to catch the edges of the bear, and he's pretty clearly defined from his background. And I'm going to brush in the bear, and you don't have to be perfect. It doesn't need to be, you know, 100% correct. You can see the auto mask is trying to grab individual hairs there. That's fine. It doesn't need to be perfect because what I'm going to do here has much more to do with the texture of that fur than it does with anything else. I'm going to zoom into a 1-to-1 where we can see the fur, and I'm going to apply the texture brush just on the fur. Okay, now watch this as I slide that slider up. See how the fur becomes much more distinct from what it was. If I took it the other way, it would kind of reduce it and make the bear look soft, but a fair application of that makes that fur really stand out. All right, go back to fit. Now, let's say what I want to do with this. Let's see, this background is a little bit too distracting for me. So I still have auto mask on because I don't want to impact the bear, but I do want to see if I can blur this background a little more. I want to make our bear stand out more from that background than he does. So you can see the auto mask actually did a pretty good job avoiding the grasses and avoiding the bear itself. It really actually did quite an excellent job. I'm kind of surprised it did so well there. It did. Now I did get a bit of the bear's face with that, so I'm going to put the erase brush. So I'm pressing the Alt key, and I get the minus sign. So now I just went in and I'm subtracting anything around the edge of the bear that might have gotten hit. And we will bring the exposure back up to normal. Now, to separate that bear from the background, I might actually want to reduce that exposure a little bit. Not too much, because it's going to start to look promptly like I've done something to the image, but you know, 1/3 of a stop or 0.4 stops, I can get away with without impacting the image too much. And I can reduce the texture and the sharpness, and if I want, the clarity of that background. And you can see the bear really starts to stand out quite a bit. You can overdo it. Clarity in particular starts to look a little fake. So I try not to mess with that too much, but I'd say that looks pretty good. Let's close that brush. Let's look at what I did here. Pretty nice, pretty good difference, huh? And the last thing we are going to do for this particular photo, and we're running out of time here today, is we're going to go up and we're going to add a slight vignette. Might be able to get away with a fair amount on this because it's kind of a portrait. And we've ended up with a, a pretty decent bear picture without spending a whole lot of time or effort on that. So let me briefly mention how to do a virtual copy. So if you want to do the same, different changes on the same image, you go to the image, you right click on a PC or on my Mac, you control click to bring up the menu. And there is an option somewhere for create virtual copy, right below stacking. Create virtual copy, and yep, images will be synced later. And you can see it, basically it copied the files over. Now, if I wanted to go back, so in the new copy, this one that just was created, all of the changes have been applied, and I can't go back on the virtual copy I've created. So think of that as saving your place on that image. But if I want to make changes to that photo we just did, I go back to the original, the first one in the line, and you can see all the changes we've made over here in the history, and I can go back to any time in the course of that image, or just start again, erase all of the settings, and go back to the beginning there. So that's how you create a virtual copy to do multiple versions of the same image. I do that a lot, especially when I'm experimenting. I often don't want to lose changes that I've made to something, and I'll use a virtual copy so I can have multiple versions of the same image. All right, let's stop the share here. Let's see what we got. Any other questions that come up? Bring up the shadows. Yep, you could bring up those shadows there, Andrew. That would have helped a bit, but it also would have brought up the shadows and the grasses in the background. And so I didn't want to do it too much in a global change or across the whole image. I definitely could have done that selectively with the brush tool. All right, so I'll. Looks like we got one person, a latecomer coming in. Yeah, so any questions, anything that you guys want me to go over quickly? I know our hour is up, but I'm happy to linger around if people have questions or things they wanted to talk about more. So if you need to check out, thanks for coming, everybody. We'll do this again next week, and next week we'll talk more about color toning. We'll talk about curves. We'll talk about what are some of the other things we're going to talk about next week? We're going to talk about sharpening and noise. We'll talk about transforming effects, and we'll talk about selectively doing different saturation, color tones, and adjusting images that way. And we'll also talk about creating HDRs and panoramas next week. So if you want to check back in for that, I will be sending around an invite via email or via the Facebook page. So. All right, so feel free to check out if you want to, but I'm happy to answer questions. So hit me if you got anything.
Hi, David.
Hey.
So, yeah, it was really neat to see how you blurred the background of the bear. And I was wondering, you use the auto mask. Does that mean that you can really only isolate if you have kind of sharp edges around your subject? Like it has to be really sharp to begin with, right?
Yeah, you have to have good separation in some kind of edge. Otherwise, AutoMask won't recognize it very effectively. So yeah, you need to have a fairly sharp edge. But you can just dodge it in and then erase. You don't have to use the AutoMask. You can just sort of messily get it in and then press that Alt key and to get to erase part of the brush and selectively go back. So it just takes a little bit more work.
Thank you.
Okay.
Question, please, David.
Sure.
Okay, when you made that virtual copy, that is a snapshot at that point of the original, so you can continue on there, but you cannot go back, correct?
Correct, exactly. So if you've reached a point that you like and you want to take it a different direction, you can create a virtual copy, and then you end up like a dividing tree.
Gotcha.
And your one image can go one direction and the other image can go the other. But yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's a snapshot of what you've got at that time.
Thank you.
All right.
Ta-da!
Ta-da! Yeah. Anybody else?
David.
Yeah.
On your DWS support, you helped me with that diver and a whale.
Yeah. And congratulations, by the way, on the contest win with that. That's super exciting.
Yeah, that was just a little bit of tweaking that changed the picture, just that little bit to put the definition in. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Use the brush tool on that one.
Yep, that's the brush tool is my favorite tool in Lightroom, probably.
You
So
taught me that when we were doing Brooks Falls.
yep, it's a good one. So yeah, congratulations on that contest. That's awesome. I looked it up. It looks like it's a pretty big deal. So well done.
Yeah, I was extremely happy.
I don't blame you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'll mute, but stay on.
Okay, great. All right. Anybody else? I see Elaine, you've got your mute off. Did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Last year, when I went to Fairbanks and I got the lights the night before we went out behind the hotel, I've got the lights from the fluorescent light.
Mm-hmm.
It messed up the snow. Any ideas on what I can do for that?
Sure. So what that kind of screwy lighting effect, so you end up with like one looking really orange or the lights looking really green or blue or something like that. So what you can do is use that brush tool and dodge in the areas that you want to change. So if you so I would recommend that you process and get, say, the northern lights looking right. So that's how you want to do. And then use the brush tool to go back in, and you can selectively change the color temperature just of that part of the frame. So here I can show you very quickly how you do that.
Well, I will try it.
Yeah, so I'll show you just briefly here. So
okay.
Here I'll just grab one of these brushes I applied, and up here is at the top of the sliders is one called temperature, and that's your color temperature, that's your white balance. And you can turn, if it's much too yellow, you can make it look blue. Oh, that's just the bear's eye, so that doesn't work. Let me choose this one. I can change the background to like weirdly blue if I wanted to. But when you're trying to change the color temperature of, say, the snow that has the the iodine city lights on it, you can do that right there.
What about that color palette that you were showing that you could use the eyedropper?
Sure.
Would that work?
It might, but it's probably not the most straightforward way to go. If you're shooting a RAW, which I know you are, you can selectively adjust the color temperature, the white balance in just a part of the frame, doing what I just showed you there, and that'll be a much more effective way to do it than it will be trying to mess with putting using the brush tool and changing the color effect.
Okay, well, I'll try and see what I can do, and I'll send you what I've done.
Sure, and if you want to, you can send me the RAW file, and I can I can show you what I would do.
Okay, that would be fabulous, because the lights were real dark green against a really dark blue sky.
Yep.
And so.
Yeah, no, that gets tricky when you've got those city lights and kind of screwing up how the image is going to look. So that gets tricky, but I think we'll be able to deal with it.
I love you. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Love you too.
Let's do this again.
All right, we will. All right, anybody else?
Go ahead, somebody.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Dave,
you had a question?
On your edited photos, there are photos that you're working on and everything, and that you just store them in separate collections or somewhere else, under separate files, or what do you do?
So photos that I'm currently working on. So I use the. Let me jump back into Lightroom and I'll show you what I do. So I use color codes for the different things I'm working on. So in my collection, so let me go down to some of them where I've got a bunch of. So these are all my images from Botswana this fall. And green images are ones that I've already processed. If there were any red images left, those are ones that I would have had set to delete, but I've already deleted them. Blues are ones that I've highlighted to keep, but have not yet gotten to yet. So I haven't processed them. They're just their natural raw format. And if they're untagged, it means I haven't really decided about them yet. I do use some other tags as well for different purposes, like yellows or people photos. Purples are ones that I'm kind of doing experimental stuff, or I'm using to teach with. And so I use color coding for images for that particular use. in terms of images that I'm actively working on, you know, usually I might come back to an image, but I usually leave it in a place where it's something I feel comfortable with. So I rarely will only go halfway through an image. You know, it's really uncommon for me to spend more than, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes on any image. And even that's a lot. You know, 2 or 3 minutes is much more typical. You know, I photographed this shot last night. And this actually took me a lot of post-processing to make this look right. I probably spent a half an hour on this shot. And so, you know, the original is, you know, something like that. So it needed a lot of work. And, you know, I used it, I put it into outside programs. I've been experimenting with Topaz software for doing some particular things. And so some images take a lot, but I rarely will stop midstream. I usually, you know, or if I do, I just remember which image I've been working on and I go back to it. So, so yeah, I don't really tag anything specifically that I'm still in process on.
Thanks.
But there's no reason you couldn't. I mean, you could just dump them into a collection and do that if you do bounce around a lot between images.
Right.
Anybody else? Of
I have a question.
course.
Karen. Hi. I joined this meeting really late, and did you mention a time zone when you mentioned 2 o'clock?
I think I did. I put mountain time down, but if I didn't, I apologize.
I'm on Pacific time, so.
Oh, I'm sorry that you missed the most of it. We are going to do this again next week, though. I will again briefly review what we've covered this time, and then we'll dive further into the program. So, and this, I actually got this to record this time. So in the next few hours, I will post a link to this both on my Facebook page and probably on my website, and I'll email it around to everybody who's in the meeting. So you'll be able to go back.
That'll be great. Thank you.
Of course.
2 questions for you, please, sir. You mentioned halos. If there's a halo around something, is there an easy way to remove that?
Yeah, so the halos that are created by the auto mask are almost impossible to remove. Let me, oops, I'm going to screen share first before I did that. Hang on, coming back. Let me show you an image that I've been fighting with for a while, and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, let's see if I can find it here first. That's always the first challenge. Let's see. So you can see my my naming scheme is not foolproof, but I can usually find things when I need them. So I don't know if the Higginses are still on this or not, but they were on this trip last year, and we had, where is it? We had a pretty epic evening at a place called Bear Lake outside of Seward, and I don't know where it is. Where did that image go? Probably called Iceberg or something.
As opposed to the trip where the captain blew an engine?
Oh, geez. Yeah, that was crazy. Yeah, that was almost a nightmare. But we did get it worked out in the end. So
that was great. That ended up working out quite well.
It did, indeed. But that's right, Fred. That's where I met you. You were on the boat that day, weren't you?
That is correct.
Thank you for reminding me of that. I was like, I know you from where did we meet? And that's where it was. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So here we go. So here is, yeah. So we had this great evening photographing it was that same trip. And actually it wasn't the same trip, it was a different trip. But we had this great evening photographing icebergs. And here's the image. So this guy, I have been trying to get deep. If I zoom in here on the horizon line, do you see how it looks? It almost looks like chromatic aberration from like a poor lens.
Yeah.
You can see right along the edge. That is because the auto mask is not able to really grab that precisely. And so there's a few little places you can see a little bit right along here along the top of the iceberg. And so that is where the auto mask fails a little bit. You know, for general use, it's still, I mean, it's still a lovely image. I like it. But I think I'm just going to have to accept the fact that I need to apply a little bit more of the same changes I was doing on the sky to the mountains here, and make it look more appropriate. So anyway, that's kind of what that does. So that's the risk of using auto mask.
Okay. I recorded the first show if you want a copy of it.
Oh, that'd be great. Yes, please. I've had several inquiries about it. So if you can just link me to it, or however you want to do it.
I will put it up on a Google Share. I need to edit the beginning and the ending off, since you don't want to be staring at the screen of my PC for 5 minutes, sort of like a test pattern.
But you look so good, Fred. I mean, it's.
Oh, flattery will get you everything, won't it? Yeah. So yeah, I will. I'll just trim it, and then I'll put it up on a Google Share. Your Gmail, right?
I am on Gmail, yeah. So you can easily get.
Okay.
Get
so
if you don't mind, I'll just copy it off from there, and then I'll share it.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thanks, Fred. I appreciate that, because I
Sure.
screwed it up last time.
Not a problem. No, I've practiced. This is a Mac that I'm using, and I'm just learning how to use a Mac.
Yeah,
They're nice machines.
they certainly are.
Yeah, somebody's already saying they'd like a copy of the first one. I see that.
Great. I'll make sure that gets shared around by you guys.
Absolutely, and my royalties are pretty rugged.
All right. Thanks, Fred.
Hey,
All right. Anybody else have questions for me before we start to take off? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I don't know if you have time right now. Could you show the original of that beautiful waterfowl photo that you put on last night?
Sure. All right, so back to my library. Yeah, this one. So it had some modifications done to it, but this is the next shot of the series. So that's what the basically what the original looked like. Actually, I think that might even have a little bit of work done to it. Nope, that's the original. So that's the shot out of camera, and then that's how it turned out in the end.
Mm-hmm.
So
thank you.
Yep. All right, any other questions? While I'm in Lightroom here, I can address anything else. Just feel free to speak up if there's something you want me to talk about in Lightroom. Otherwise, I'll stop the screen share.
That waterfowl.
Yep.
There's a lot of white spots. You could get rid of that with spot removal tool, couldn't you, if you wanted?
I could, but I actually opted to keep it. I got rid of a few distracting ones. If I go to that next slide, I can probably show you. See, there were a few ones up here, here, and here. But I kind of liked it. It kind of gave this confetti look. So that was a purposeful decision to keep them. They were insects all over the tops of the water, and I didn't want to take that away. Yes, I could have gotten rid of them in Lightroom or in using the clone tool. I purposely did not.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, of course. Anybody else? All right. Well, as always, feel free to email me questions. I will send around a link to this talk if you want to review it. And we'll do the same thing, barring no conflicts on my end, next Thursday at the same time, 2 p.m. Mountain Time, where we'll dive even further into Lightroom. And then we'll see if there's room for a fourth talk. And if not, we'll start talking about something different until this pandemic's over and we can move on with our lives. So. All right, thanks everybody for coming. And yeah, feel free to send me more questions if you've got them.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Andrew. Take care.
Thank you.
Yep, see you, Elaine. Bye all.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was